Chapter 1: Economics and Economic Reasoning. Economics is the study of how human beings coordinate their wants and desires given the decision-making mechanisms, social customs, and political realities of society. Coordination central problems. 1. What and how much to produce. 2. How to produce it. 3. For whom to produce it. Scarcity. The goods available are too few to satisfy individuals' needs, wants, and desires. 1. Our wants and our means of fulfilling those wants. 2. Degree changes. The quantity of goods, services, and usable resources depends on technology and human action which underlie production. Microeconomics. The study of individual choice and how the choice is influenced by economic forces. Macroeconomics. The study of the economy as a whole. Economic reasoning. Making decisions on the basis of cost and benefits. Marginal cost is the additional cost to you over and above the costs you have already incurred. Sunk cost. Costs that have already been incurred and cannot be recovered. Marginal benefit is the additional benefit above what you've already derived. Economic decision-making rule. If marginal cost is higher than marginal benefit, do not. If marginal benefit is higher than marginal cost, do. Opportunity cost is the benefit that would have been gained from choosing the next best alternative, i.e., the net benefit from the best option. Implicit costs. Costs associated with the decision that are not included in normal accounting costs. Economic, social, and political forces. Important because all scarce goods need to be rationed. Efficiency. Achieving a goal as cheaply as possible. Economic forces. The necessary reaction to scarcity. The invisible hand. Invisible hand / the price mechanism. The rise and fall of prices that guides our actions in a market. Prices will tend to allocate resources efficiently, achieving a goal as cheaply as possible. Market forces. Force that is given relatively free rein by society to work through the market. Social and cultural forces. Forces that guide individual actions even though those actions may not be in an individual's self-interest. Political and legal forces. Legal directives that direct individuals' actions play a major role in deciding whether and how much to let the market forces operate. Economic policies, actions, inaction, taken by government to influence economic actions. Economic perceptions. Positive economics is a study of what is and how the economy works. Normative economics is a study of what the goals of the economy should be. Art of economics is the application of positive economics to achieve the goals determined in normative economics. Chapter 2: The Productions Possibility Model, Trade, and Globalization. Productions Possibilities Model. Productions Possibility Table. A table that lists a choice's opportunity cost by summarizing what alternative outputs you can achieve with your inputs. Output, the result of an activity. Input, what you put into a production process to achieve an output. Productions Possibility Curve is a curve measuring the maximum combination of outputs that can be obtained from a given number of inputs. Downward slope represents the opportunity cost concept. You get more of one benefit only if you get less of another benefit. There is a limit to what you can achieve given the existing institutions, resources, and technology. Every choice you make has an opportunity cost. You can only get more of something by giving up something else. Principle of increasing marginal opportunity costs. In order to get more of something, one must give up ever-increasing quantities of something else. Comparative advantage. The ability of being better suited to the production of one good than to the production of another good. Why the production possibility curve is bowed outwards. Some resources are better suited for the production of certain kinds of goods than other kinds of goods. Productive efficiency. Achieve as much output as possible from a given amount of inputs or resources. Inefficiency. Getting less output from inputs than if devoted to some other activity would produce more output. Efficiency. Achieving a goal using as few inputs as possible. Production possibility curve shifts. When technology or other economic institutions improve or decrease efficiency or available resources. Trade and comparative advantage. Adam Smith argued that it is humankind's proclivity to trade that leads to individuals using their comparative advantage. Markets lead to economic growth. Markets allow specialization and encourage trade. Laissez-faire. An economic policy of leaving coordination of individuals' actions to the market. Specialization and trade create gains that make all better off. Trade lets countries consume beyond their production possibility curve. When trade is allowed, the slope of the combined production possibilities curve is determined by the country with the lowest opportunity costs. It is by producing where costs are lowest that countries can achieve gains from trade. The market does not directly take fairness into account. The market is interested only in who can produce a good or service at the lowest cost. The competitive front will determine whether the U.S. can maintain much higher wages than developing countries is not the competition in current industries, but competition in industries of the futures. Globalization. The increasing integration of economies, cultures, and institutions across the world. Increase the size of the market, increase the number of competitors. Value of a currency relative to the value of foreign currencies. Law of one price. The wages of workers in one country will not differ significantly from the wages of equal workers in another institutionally similar country. Chapter 3. Economic Institutions. Economic institutions. Markets are highly developed social constructs that are a part of a country's social and economic institutions. Institutions. The formal and informal rules that constrain human economic behavior. U.S. economy and historical perspective. Market economy. An economic system based on private property and the market in which, in principle, individuals follow their own self-interest while market forces of supply and demand are relied on to coordinate those individual pursuits. Distribution of goods is to each individual according to his ability, effort, inherent property, and luck. Private property rights. The control a private individual or firm has over an asset. Evolving economic systems. Capitalism. Significant government roles in the directing their economies. Socialism. Economic system based on individuals' goodwill towards others, not on their own self-interest, in which, in principle, society decides what, how, and for whom to produce, each according to his ability, each according to his needs. U.S. economy. Business. Private producing units in our society. Decide what to produce, how, and for whom to produce it. Make the central economic decisions on the basis of their own self-interests and market incentives. Businesses are ultimately made up of a group of people organized. Entrepreneurship, the ability to organize, get something done. 2. Distribution, as important as production, is a central component of service economy. Consumer sovereignty. The consumer's wishes determine what's produced. Profit is what's left over from total revenues after all the appropriate costs have been subtracted. Households. Groups of individuals living together and making joint decisions. The most powerful economic institution. Ultimately control government, vote, and business what they buy. Supplier of labor. The largest source of household income is wages and salaries. Supply the labor with which businesses produce and govern governments. Household decide how much schooling to get and what to buy. Government plays 2 general roles in the economy. Government as an actor collects funds, taxes, and participates in the economy at a local, state, and federal level. Government as a referee sets the rules of interaction in markets. Changing the rules decides whether economic forces will be allowed to operate freely. Roles of government. 1. Provide a stable set of institutions and rules. Includes set of laws specifying what can and cannot be done, as well as a mechanism to enforce those laws. Promoting effective and workable competition. Monopoly power. The ability of firms to prevent other individuals or firms from entering the same kind of business. Correct for externalities. Externality. The effect of a decision on a third party not taken into account by the decision maker, negative and positive. Ensuring economic stability and growth. 3. Potential role of providing economic stability, macroeconomic externalities that affect the economy as a whole. 4. Providing public goods. Public good must be supplied to all, and the consumption by one does not prevent its consumption by another individual. Private good is a good that, when consumed by one individual, cannot be consumed by another individual. Free rider, a person who gets a benefit but does not contribute to paying for the cost of that benefit. 5. Adjusting for undesirable market results. A controversial role to adjust the results of the market when those market results are seen as socially undesirable. Demerit goods or activities, bad for people even though they choose or use the goods or engage in the activities. Merit goods or activities, good for you. Government encourage them through subsidies or tax benefits. Market failures are situations in which the market does not lead to desired results. Government failures, situations in which the government fails to intervene. Chapter 4. Supply and demand. Demand, willingness and ability to pay. Law of demand. Quantity demanded rises as price falls, other things constant. Quantity demanded falls as price, other things constant, rises. Substitute makes this possible. Existing buyers will buy more, new buyers will start to buy. Other things constant places a limitation on the application of the law of demand. Demand curve. The graphic representation of the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Demand curve slopes downward. Price and quantity demanded are inversely related. Demand refers to a schedule of quantities of a good that will be bought per unit of time at various prices, other things constant. Quantity demanded refers to a specific amount that will be demanded per unit of time at a specific price, other things constant. Market demand is the horizontal sum of all individual demand curves. Shift in demand versus movements along a demand curve. Movement along a demand curve, the graphical representation of effect of a change in price on a quantity demanded. Shift in demand, the graphical representation of the effect of anything other than price on demand. Income. Price of other goods. Substitutes. Positive correlation. Alternative products. Supplement. Complements. Negative correlation. Connected products. Tastes. Expectations. Taxes and subsidies. Supply. Law of supply. Quantity supplied rises as price rises, other things constant. Quantity supplied falls as price falls, other things constant. At high prices, existing producers supply more. At higher prices, new suppliers enter the market. The supply curve, the graphical representation of the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Supply curve slope upward to the right. Positive correlation. Supply referrals to a schedule of quantities the seller is willing to sell at a per unit of time at various price, other things constant, the whole curve. Quantity supplied refers to a specific amount that will be supplied at a specific price, a point on the curve. Market supply curve is the horizontal sum of all individual supply curves. Shifts in supply versus movements along a supply curve. Movement along a supply curve, the graphical representation of the effect of a change in price on the quantity supplied. Shift in supply, the graphical representation of the effect of a change in a factor other than price on supply. Price if inputs, technology, expectations. Equilibrium. Equilibrium, the concept in which opposing dynamic forces cancel each other out. Equilibrium quantity is among the bought and sold at the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price is the price towards which the invisible hand drives the market. At the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. The price that clears alternative, the price that clears the market. Alternative prices at which opposing forces agree on price and quantity supplied. Excess supply. A surplus quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and some suppliers will not be able to sell all their goods. Excess demand. A shortage quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. Fallacy of composition. The false assumption that what is true for a part will also be true for the whole. Price adjusts. When quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, shortage prices tend to rise. When quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, surplus prices then tend to fall. The greater the difference, the more pressure there is for price to rise. Chapter 5, Using Supply and Demand. Government Intervention in the Market. Price ceilings. A government-imposed limit on how high a price can be charged. To be effective, must be below the current equilibrium price. Quantity demanded will exceed quantity supplied. There will be an excess demand. Rent control. A price ceiling on rents, set by the government. Price floors. Government-imposed limits on how low a price can be charged. To be effective, a price floor needs to be above the existing price. Quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, and the result is excess supply. Minimum wage law. Laws specifying the lowest wage a firm can legally pay an employee. Excess tax. A tax that is levied on specific goods. Tariff is an excess tax on an imported good. Quantity restrictions. Governments often interfere with or regulate markets is with license, which entry into a market. Quantity restrictions tend to increase price. Third-party payer markets. The person who receives the good differs from the person paying for the good. In third-party payer markets, equilibrium quantity and total spending are much higher. Anytime a third payer system exists, the quantity demanded will be higher than it otherwise would be. Market forces will not hold costs as much as they would otherwise because the person using the service doesn't have an incentive to hold. Chapter 6, Price Elasticity. Price elasticity. Elasticity tells us exactly how much quantity responds to a change in price. Price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. Price elasticity of supply is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. Positive over absolute number. Measure percent, not until change in variable. Calculating elasticity. Standard. Price 2 minus price 1 over price 1 all over quantity 2 minus quantity 1 over quantity 1. Arc convention. P2 minus P1 over P1 plus P2 divided by 2. Q2 minus Q1 all over Q1 plus Q2 over 2. Endpoint problem. Percentage change is different depending on whether you view the change as a rise or decline, or unsure of what variable is change versus original. Classify demand and supply as elastic or inelastic. Perfectly elastic. E equals affinity. Quantity responds enormously to changes in price. Elastic. E is greater than 1. If the percentage change in quantity is greater than the percentage change in price. Unit elastic. E is equal to 1. The percentage change in quantity equals the percentage change in price. Inelastic. If the percentage change in quantity is less than the percentage change in price. Perfectly inelastic. Quantity does not respond at all to change in price. Elasticity and supply and demand curves. Elasticity is not the same as slope. Related to slope, but not the same. The steeper the curve becomes at a given point, the less elastic is supply and demand. The more horizontal the curve becomes at a given point, the more elastic is supply and demand. Elasticity changes along straight line curves. On straight line curves and demand curves, slope does not change, but elasticity does. Substitutionary inelasticity. Substitution in elasticity. How responsive quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be to a change in price is dependent on substitution. The more substitutes a good has, the more elastic its supply and demand. Substitute of demand. Number of substitutes is affected by several factors. Four most common: the time period being considered. The larger the time period, the more elastic equals more alternatives. The degree to which the industry is a luxury. The market definition. Broad, less inelastic; narrow, more elastic. The importance of the good in one's budgets. Larger the proportion, the more elastic. Irrational. Substitution of supply. Time period. The larger the time period being considered, the more elastic the supply is. Instantaneous period. Quantity supply, if fixed, so supply is perfectly inelastic. Momentary supply. Short run. Some substitution is possible, somewhat elastic. Long run. Significant substitution is possible, very elastic. Elasticity, total revenue, and demand. See chart, page 167. If demand is elastic, a rise in prices lowers revenue. If demand is unit elastic, a rise in price leaves total revenue unchanged. If demand is inelastic, a rise in price increases total revenue. Price discrimination. If a firm can somehow set people with less elastic demand from those with more elastic demand, it can charge more to the individuals with inelastic demand and less to the individuals with elastic demand. Other elasticity measures. Income elasticity of demand, the percentage change in demand divided by the percentage change in income. Responsiveness of demand to change income. Cause a shift, not a movement. A change is something other than price. Normal good. Consumption increases with an increase in income. Luxuries. Goods that have income elasticity greater than 1% increase greater as the percent increase in income. Necessity. A good that has an income elasticity between 0 and 1 rises by smaller proportions than the rise in income. Inferior good. Consumption decreases with income increases. Cross-price elasticity of demand, the percentage change in demand divided by the percentage change in price of a related good. Substitutes. Goods that can be used in place of one another. Complements are goods that are used in conjunction with one another. Chapter 7. Producer and consumer surplus. Consumer surplus. The value the consumer gets from buying a product less its price, represents by the area underneath the demand curve and above the price an individual pays. Producer surplus. The price the producer sells a product less than the cost of producing it, i.e., is represented by the area above the supply curve but below the price the producer receives. Burden of taxation. Cost of taxation. In almost all cases, taxes reduce or limit trade. Taxes on a supplier shift the supply curve up. In most cases, equilibrium prices rise and equilibrium quantity declines. Taxes on consumers shift the demand curve up, raising equilibrium price and reducing the equilibrium quantity. Deadweight loss. The loss of consumer and producer surplus from a tax. Welfare / deadweight loss triangle. A geometric representation of the cost in terms of misallocated resources because by a deviation from the supply-demand curve equilibrium. Tax incidence. Who bears the burden of a tax? Burden depends on relative elasticity. Excess tax. As a tax levied on a specific good, the person who physically pays the tax is not necessarily the person who bears the burden of the tax. In reality, the tax burden is rarely shared equally because elasticity are rarely unequal. The relative burden of the tax follows this general rule. The more inelastic one's relative supply and demand, the larger the burden of tax one will bear. Government intervention. Rent-seeking activities. Activities designed to transfer surplus from one group to another. Rent-seeking activities require resources, and the new result is unproductive. People care more about their own surplus than they do about total surplus. General rule of political economy. When small groups are helped by a government action and large groups are hurt by the same action, the small groups tend to lobby far more effectively than the large group. Chapter 8. Government policy and market failure. Market failure. A situation in which the invisible hand pushes in such a way that individual decisions do not lead to socially desirable outcomes. Externalities. Effects of a decision on a third party that are not taken into account by the decision maker. Negative externalities. The effect of a decision not taken into account by the decision maker are detrimental to others. Marginal cost. Marginal private cost of production plus the cost of negative externalities associated with that production. Positive externalities. When the effect of a decision not taken into account by the decision maker are beneficial to others. Marginal social benefit. The marginal private benefit of consuming a good plus the benefit of the positive externalities resulting from that good. Methods of dealing with externalities. Direct regulation. The amount of a good people are allowed to use is directly limited by the government. Incentive policies. Tax incentive program. A program using a tax to create incentives for individuals to structure their activities in a way that is consistent with the desired ends. Affluent fees. Charges imposed by the government on the level of pollution created. Market incentive plan. A plan requiring market participants to certify that they have reduced total consumption, not necessarily their own individual consumption, by a specified amount. Voluntary solutions. Make reduction voluntary, leaving individuals free to choose whether to follow what is socially optimal or what is privately optimal. Very common, very successful. Free rider program. Individuals unwilling to share in the cost of a public good. Optimal policy. One in which the marginal cost of undertaking the policy equals the marginal benefit of that policy. Public good. A good that is non-exclusive. No one can be excluded from its benefits. And non-rival. Consumption by one does not preclude consumption by another. Informational problems. Imperfect information can be a cause of market failure. Adverse selection problem. A problem that occurs when buyers and sellers have different amounts of information about the good for sale. Moral hazard problem. A problem that arises when people do not have to bear the negative consequence of their actions. Signaling. An action taken by an informed party that reveals information to an uninformed party that offsets the false signal that caused the adverse selection problem in the first place. Screening. An action taken by the uninformed party that includes the informed party to reveal information. Government failure and market failure. Government failure. When government intervention in the market to improve the market failure makes the situation worse. Why? Government does not have an incentive to correct the problem. Government does not have enough information to deal with the problem. Interventions in markets is almost always more complicated than it initially seems. The bureaucratic nature of government intervention does not allow fine-tuning. Government intervention leads to more government. Chapters 9 and 10. Trade. Balance of trade. The difference between the value of exports and the value imports. Dividing up the gains from trade. The more competition, the less the trader gets. Smaller countries get a larger percent of the gain than larger companies. Countries producing goods with economies of scale get larger gains from trade. Principles of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. As long as the relative opportunity cost of producing goods, what must be given up in one good in order to get another good, differs among countries, then there are potential gains from trade. Sources of U.S. comparative advantage. Skill of the U.S. workforce. U.S. government institutions. U.S. physical and technological infrastructure. English, the language of business. Wealth from past production. U.S. natural resources. Cachet. Inertia. U.S. intellectual property rights. Relatively open immigration policy. Inherent comparative advantage. Comparative advantages that are based on factors that are relatively unchangeable. Transferable comparative advantage. Comparative advantage based on factors that can change relatively easily. Law of one price. In a competitive market, there will be pressure for equal factors to be priced equally. Convergence hypothesis. The tendency of economic forces to eliminate transferable comparative advantage. Trade restrictions. Tariffs are taxes governments place on international traded goods. Most used and most familiar type of trade restriction. Make imported goods relatively more expensive. Quotas are quantity limits placed on imports. Increase price and reduced import quantity. Government collects no revenue. Voluntary restraint agreement are when countries voluntarily restrict their exports. Embargo is a total restriction on the import or export of a good. Regulatory trade restriction. Government-imposed procedural rules that limit imports. Naturalistic appeals help restrict trade through social forces. Trade restrictions. Regulatory trade restrictions. Government-imposed procedural rules that limit imports. Reasons. Unequal distribution of the gains of trade. Benefits of trade are generally widely scattered among the entire population. In contrast, cost of free trade often falls on small groups of people. Trade adjustment assistance programs. Programs designed to compensate losers for reduction in trade restrictions. Haggling by companies of the gains of trade. Strategic bargaining. Demanding a larger share of the gains from trade than you can reasonably expect. Haggling by countries over trade restrictions. Strategic trade policies. Threatening to implement tariffs to bring about a reduction in tariffs or some other concession from the other country. Specialized production. Learning by doing. Becoming better at a task the more often you perform it. Economies of scale. Situation in which per unit of output falls as output increases. Infant industry argument. With initial production, an industry will be able to become more competitive. Macroeconomics aspect of trade. National security, international policies, increased revenue brought in by tariffs. Oppose trade restrictions. From a global perspective, free trade increases total output. International trade provides competition for domestic companies. Restrictions based on national security are often abused or evaded. Trade restrictions are addictive.